So this is a revision video for Year 9 on topic 9D, and we are going to be looking at diseases. So just to cover, we are going to look at textbook pages 54 and 55, which you can access on the Active Learn website. So to start off, what is a disease? So a disease is anything that stops the body operating the way that it normally does. The one exception to that is that doesn't include any kind of physical injury. So if you were to break your arm, technically that would stop your body operating the way it normally would. But because that would be a physical injury, that isn't classed as a disease. And we can divide diseases into two kind of main categories. And the first category is communicable disease. So a communicable disease is any disease that can be passed on from person to person or animal to animal, plant to plant. And the reason that can happen is they're caused by something called pathogens. And those pathogens can be spread from individual to individual, and that is what causes the disease to be passed on between individuals. The other type of disease is what we call a non-communicable disease, and those are the opposite. So those are diseases that are not contagious. So if you have a non-communicable disease, something like type 2 diabetes or skin cancer, you cannot pass that on to someone else. So that is classed as a non-communicable disease. So infectious, or as we've said, communicable diseases, as we said, are diseases that are caused by pathogens or microbes. And those pathogens get inside the body and they then change how the body normally works. So examples of those would be coronavirus or COVID-19. So the virus particles get inside your body, in particular at the lungs, and they affect how those organs would normally work to cause disease. Other examples include things like chickenpox, which is caused by a virus, and then also cholera, which is caused by a type of bacteria. We also have deficiency diseases. Now, deficiency diseases are, again, one of those non-communicable diseases that can't be passed on. And these are diseases that are caused by not having the right level of the different types of nutrients in your diet. So, for example, not getting enough vitamin D can cause a disease called rickets, where it causes the bones to kind of soften a little bit. And if you look at the picture here, you can see that this child here has started to get a bit of what we call a bowing of the legs, where they kind of bend outwards. Or it could be something like not getting enough protein in the diet, which causes this sort of swelling of the abdomen or the stomach area. That's caused by a lack of protein. Or a lack of vitamin C in the diet can cause a disease called scurvy. And you can see from the picture here that causes kind of awful sort of wounds on the skin and bleeding gums. So those are deficiency diseases. Another type of disease are genetic diseases. And these are caused by mutations or faults in the DNA, and they're passed down from parent to child. And although they're passed down from parent to child, they're still classed as non-communicable, because if someone has one of those diseases, they can't give it to other people in the population. They can only kind of pass it down their family line. And examples of genetic diseases are things like cystic fibrosis or something called sickle cell anemia. So remember, these diseases are non-communicable, but they are passed down from parent to child. We also have lifestyle diseases. So again, these are an example of a non-communicable disease, and these are caused by the different ways that people live. So for example, if someone has a poor diet with poor levels of physical activity and exercise, they're at higher risk of things like obesity or type 2 diabetes. Exposing yourself to certain chemicals like smoking or from pollution can increase your risk of diseases like lung cancer. Or things like exposure to excessive UV radiation from sunlight can increase your risk of skin cancer. So all these types of diseases are classified as lifestyle diseases, and they're caused by the way we live and kind of often the choices you make in your life in terms of diet, smoking, and levels of exercise. The final category of disease is what we call an autoimmune disease. So this is actually caused by the body's own immune system, which normally protects you against diseases, actually turns against the body, and the immune system starts to attack the body's own cells. Now, these diseases actually kind of fit into the genetic category as well, because they do tend to be passed down from parent to child. So, an example might be celiac disease or type 1 diabetes. And in both of these diseases, they're caused by the immune system turning against the cells and the organs of the body. And quite often, if a parent has type 1 diabetes or celiac disease, the child is more likely to have it as well. So there is a bit of a genetic element included in those as well. So just to recap, we've looked at the different types of diseases. So we've looked at the 5 different kind of categories. We started off looking at communicable diseases. We then looked at deficiency diseases caused by not having the right levels of things in your diet. We looked at genetic diseases, which are passed down from parent to child. We looked at lifestyle diseases, which are caused by things that happen to you in your lifetime, like poor diet, exposure to chemicals in cigarette smoke. And we also looked at autoimmune diseases, which do have a genetic element, and they're caused by the body's immune system turning against its own cells and attacking them. So what we're going to look at now is a little bit more on communicable disease. So as we said, these are diseases caused by pathogens, and they are passed on from person to person, which means they're contagious. And what causes that is the pathogens being spread from person to person. So for example, if someone is infected with a bacteria, if they cough and sneeze, someone else can then be exposed to that bacteria, and then they can get the disease as well. And there's 4 main pathogens that you need to know about. So we've got bacteria, which cause diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. We've got fungus, which cause fungal diseases like athlete's foot. We've got protists, which cause diseases such as sleeping sickness or malaria. And then finally, we have viruses, which cause lots of different diseases, things like coronavirus, influenza or flu, chickenpox, and blue tongue disease in animals as well. So let's just have a little bit of a look at viruses in more detail. So a virus is quite a simple structure. Now, there's a bit of argument as to whether viruses are classed as living cells or not, because all viruses have is they have kind of an outer protein coat, and then inside that protein coat, they've just got some form of genetic material. So that could be DNA, for example. So they've got the genetic material, and that genetic material is surrounded by a protein coat. So you can see they've got none of the other complicated structures that other cells have. So they don't have mitochondria, for example, or they don't have a nucleus. Now, what that means, though, for these viruses, so if this is one virus particle, for this virus particle to replicate itself and to make more copies of itself, it can't do that on its own. So what it needs to do is it needs to infect other cells. So these would be some virus particles here. You can see they've got their protein coat around the outside, and they've got their genetic material. And this here would be the cell that it's going to infect, which we could call the host cell. So if this was, say, coronavirus, this could be a cell in your lungs. And what would happen is the virus particle would attach to the cell, and then once it's attached to the cell, it will inject its genetic material into the cell. What that cell can then do, it's going to use the host cell to make more copies of itself. So it's going to use all the machinery inside the host cell to make more copies of the virus particle. So we'd make loads more copies. And remember, the virus can't actually do this on its own. It needs to be inside the host cell to do that. So it makes loads of copies. And then once it's done that, the next step is those particles, those virus particles, are going to burst out of the cell. So you can see here, this would be our host cell, which has now been burst open, a bit like a water balloon bursting, and all the virus particles are expelled from the host cell. And then this can basically start again. So each of these virus particles can then go and find another host cell to go and infect. Now, if we look here, this cell is now really damaged. That cell is now going to die. And it's no longer going to be able to do what it normally does. So that's how viruses are going to cause disease. They insert their genetic material into the cells, they use the cell to make loads of copies of itself, and then they burst out of the cell. And when they burst out of the cell, they cause a lot of damage to that cell. The cell's going to die, and that's what then causes the illness and the symptoms of the disease. So, for example, if this was in the lungs, your lungs are going to start to feel not too good right now once those particles have burst out. So that's pretty much the end of the video. Just to recap, we've looked at what a disease is, we've looked at some different types of diseases, and we've done a little bit of a focus on viruses which cause communicable diseases.